The morning Theodora Winslow arrived at Sinclair House, it was raining. Not the soft kind of rain that poets write about, the kind that comes down hard and sideways, that soaks through wool and pride alike, that makes a woman question every decision that led her to standing on the wrong side of a wrought-iron gate at 7 in the morning, with a single trunk and a letter she had already read so many times the ink had begun to blur at the edges. The letter was from her father's solicitor. It said, in the careful language of men paid to soften terrible things, that the Winslow family holdings, all of them, including the house on Carver Street, the textile accounts, and the small plot of land her mother had inherited from her own mother, were now the property of Sinclair Steel. It also said, and this was the part Theodora had read most carefully, that there was an arrangement, if she agreed to it. Alderwick was a city built on iron and ambition, the kind of city where church steeples competed with smokestacks for the skyline, and where a man's worth was measured in tonnage and rail contracts. It was loud even when it was quiet. You could feel the city underfoot, a low, constant vibration, like the earth itself was working a second shift. At the center of all of it was Montgomery Sinclair. She had never met him. Nobody in her particular circle had, not really. You didn't meet Montgomery Sinclair. You read about him in the papers. You heard his name spoken carefully in rooms where you weren't supposed to be listening. You learned slowly and through the second-hand stories of other ruined men that his signature on a document was the last signature that mattered. He had built Sinclair Steel from a single foundry in the north quarter of Alderwick into an operation that now employed nearly 1/3 of the city's working men. He owned the rail lines that moved his steel south. He owned, it turned out, a considerable portion of the debt that had swallowed her father's business whole. He was not described as a villain in the stories people told about him. He was simply described as inevitable. The butler who opened the gate did not ask her name. He simply looked at her trunk, looked at her face, and said, "Miss Winslow, Mr. Sinclair is expecting you in the east study." The house was not what she had imagined. She had expected something cold, something built to impress and intimidate, all sharp angles and imported marble. What she found instead was a house that had been furnished with precision rather than warmth, everything chosen for its function, its quality, its permanence. There were no flowers in the entryway, no portraits of smiling relatives on the walls, just dark wood, clean lines, and the kind of silence that felt like it had been maintained deliberately, the way a man maintains a ledger. The east study was at the end of a long corridor. The butler knocked once, opened the door, and stepped aside. Theodora walked in. Montgomery Sinclair was standing at the window. He didn't turn around immediately. She had the distinct impression that this was not an oversight, that he had heard her enter and had chosen, quite deliberately, to finish reading whatever document he was holding before acknowledging her presence. It was not rude, exactly. It was simply a demonstration of how time worked in this house, whose time mattered and how much. She stood still and let him finish. When he finally turned, she noticed 3 things in quick succession. He was taller than the newspapers suggested. His expression was entirely neutral, not cold, not warm, simply absent of performance. And his eyes moved over her once, quickly and without embarrassment, the way a man reviews a proposal before deciding whether it merits a second reading. "Miss Winslow," he said, not a question. "Mr. Sinclair," she replied. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. She sat. He did not. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain was audible against the window glass. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock was ticking. "You've read the terms," he said finally. "I have, and you understand them." It wasn't quite a question either. She answered it anyway. "I understand that my father's remaining debts, totaling $42,000, will be absorbed by Sinclair Steel. I understand that my family will retain the house on Carver Street and its contents. I understand that in exchange for these considerations, I will enter into a legal marriage contract with you to last a minimum of 2 years, after which either party may petition for dissolution, provided the terms of the agreement have been honored." She had memorized it, every word of it. She had sat at her father's kitchen table for 2 nights straight and memorized every single line, because she had learned a long time ago that the only protection a woman had in a room full of powerful men was knowing exactly what had been written down. Montgomery Sinclair looked at her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, nothing that generous, but something. A small recalibration. "That's correct," he said. "May I ask one question before I sign?" He sat down then, finally, and folded his hands on the desk. "Go ahead." "Why me?" The question sat in the air between them. She watched him consider it. Not the way a man considers a question he doesn't know the answer to, but the way a man considers how much of the answer to give. Your father's textile connections give me access to a supply chain I've been negotiating for 18 months, he said. A marriage to his daughter simplifies that negotiation considerably. It signals commitment. It closes the conversation. So I am a signal, she said. You are a solution, he replied. There was no cruelty in it. That almost made it worse. Theodora looked down at the document on the desk between them. It was 12 pages long. She had read every line of those pages too, but she looked at them again now, slowly, as if she were reading them for the first time. Not because she had missed anything, but because she wanted him to see that she was not rushing, that she was not desperate, even if desperation was precisely what had brought her here. She picked up the pen. There is one condition I'd like added, she said. His eyes didn't narrow, but something in his posture changed. A slight stillness, like a man who has just realized the conversation is not going exactly as planned. The terms have already been reviewed by... I understand that, she said. This is a small condition. I would like it written that my younger sister, Clara, is not to be approached for any future business arrangement, financial negotiation, or contractual consideration by Sinclair Steel, or any of its affiliated entities, for a period of no less than 10 years. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She held the pen and waited. Montgomery Sinclair had negotiated contracts with railroad barons, with senators, with men who had spent decades learning how to sit across a table and take what they wanted while appearing to give. He had never once, in the course of those negotiations, been caught completely still by a single sentence. He looked at the woman across his desk, at the rain still damp in her hair, at the careful set of her shoulders, at the way she was holding that pen like she had every right to be holding it, and he felt something he had not expected to feel in this particular meeting. He felt for just a moment interested. That can be added, he said. She wrote the condition herself in the margin of the final page, in clear and even handwriting. Then she signed her name beneath it, Theodora Winslow, soon to be Theodora Sinclair. He signed below her. Neither of them said congratulations, neither of them smiled. She set the pen down, stood, and said, I'll need my trunk brought to whatever room has been prepared. Mrs. Harlow will show you, he said, already looking back at the document. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when he spoke again, without looking up. Miss Winslow. She stopped. You'll find that I keep a very orderly house, he said. I have certain expectations regarding schedule, discretion, and conduct in public. Mrs. Harlow will go over the details. Theodora stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds. Mr. Sinclair, she said, her voice entirely even. So do I. She left. That night, in a room she had never slept in before, in a house that did not yet feel like anything close to hers, Theodora sat at the edge of the bed and opened the small leather case she kept at the bottom of her trunk. Inside was a letter, not the solicitor's letter, a different one, older, written in a hand she recognized. Though she had not spoken to the person who wrote it in nearly 3 years, she did not read it. She simply held it. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Alderwick was quiet for the first time all day. That brief, suspended silence that cities sometimes find in the deep hours of the night, when even the furnaces are resting. Theodora placed the letter back in the case, closed it, and lay down on top of the covers fully dressed. She stared at the ceiling and thought about what she had done, not with regret, with the particular clarity that comes after an irreversible decision, when the door has closed and the only direction left is forward. She had signed the contract, and she had kept her secret. For now, that was enough. There were rules to Sinclair House, not written ones, nothing so direct as that, but rules nonetheless, the kind that exist in the architecture of a place, in the timing of meals, in the way the staff moved through the corridors with a particular efficiency that suggested everything had long ago been decided and was no longer open for discussion. Breakfast was served at 6:45 in the morning, not 7, not 6:30, 6:45. And if you arrived at 6:46, the kitchen had already begun clearing. Montgomery Sinclair was always there before her. Every morning, without exception, he was already seated at the far end of the long dining table, already reading correspondence, financial reports, railway schedules, whatever demanded his attention that particular day, with a cup of black coffee at his right hand and an expression that suggested the rest of the world was an interruption he was graciously tolerating. He did not look up when she entered. He did not stand, which surprised her the first morning and then stopped surprising her entirely by the third. This was not the dining room of a courtship. This was a working arrangement between two people who had signed their names to the same document and now shared a postal address. She sat at her end of the table. They ate in silence. It was, she told herself, perfectly fine. The first 2 weeks inside Sinclair House taught Theodora several things she had not known about the man she had married. He worked more hours than she had thought possible for a single human being. He was at his desk before the household stirred, and still there most nights long after dinner had been cleared, and the last lamp in the corridor had been turned low. She had walked past the east study at 11 o'clock one night on her way back from the library and seen the thin line of light still burning under the door. She had not knocked. She had kept walking. He had no close friends that she could identify. Colleagues, yes. Men who came to the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, who sat in the east study for an hour or two and left with the slightly dazed expression of people who had just been told a great many things very efficiently. But no one who stayed for dinner without it being a scheduled event. No one who laughed too loudly in the front hall. No one who seemed to know him in the way that requires years and carelessness. He did not drink. Not at dinner. Not at the end of a long day. She had noticed this early and quietly filed it away. And he read, voraciously, seriously, across subjects that had nothing to do with steel or finance. She had catalogued the titles on his study shelves during the one afternoon Mrs. Harlow had shown her through the ground floor rooms. History, natural philosophy. A worn copy of Marcus Aurelius with what appeared to be actual annotations in the margins. 2 shelves of maps. She had not expected the maps. Their interactions in those first weeks were brief and functional. He informed her on the 4th day that they were expected at the Hartwell dinner on Friday evening. He said it the way a man reads a schedule item aloud, factual complete, requiring no response beyond acknowledgement. Of course, she said. The Hartwells are significant, he added, which she understood to mean behave accordingly. I am familiar with the Hartwells, she replied, which she understood him to understand meant, I do not need instructions on how to conduct myself in a dining room. He looked at her for a moment over the edge of his correspondence. Good, he said, and returned to his reading. At the Hartwell dinner she wore the dark blue dress she had brought from Carver Street. Not the finest thing she owned, but the most precise. She sat beside him at the table and spoke when she was spoken to and listened very carefully to everything being said around her. She laughed at the right moments. She asked Mrs. Hartwell about her daughter's recent trip to Philadelphia with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know the answer. She did not perform. She simply paid attention, which had always been her particular talent. The ability to be fully present in a room in a way that made people feel, without quite knowing why, that they had been seen. On the carriage ride home, Montgomery said nothing for the first several minutes. Then, without turning from the window, he said, Eleanor Hartwell asked me before we left where I had been hiding you. Theodora looked at the passing street. What did you tell her? I told her you had been managing a family matter. That's accurate enough. Another silence. The carriage turned onto the wide avenue that led to Sinclair House. You handled the evening well, he said, still facing the window. It was not effusive. It was barely even warm, but it was the first unrequested thing he had said to her that was not logistical in nature, and she held it quietly in her chest for a moment before letting it settle. Thank you, she said simply. He did not say anything else. But when the carriage stopped and the footman opened the door, Montgomery stepped out first and then turned and offered her his hand. He had not done that before. She took it, stepped down onto the wet cobblestone, and he released it the moment she was steady. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She thought about it longer than that. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week that Theodora first saw the other side of him. She had been in the library. She had claimed the library as her room within the house, the place where she went when she needed to feel like herself, when she heard raised voices from the corridor, not shouting. Montgomery Sinclair did not shout, but the kind of controlled intensity that is somehow more alarming than volume, the kind that means a man is choosing every word with surgical precision and intending each one to land exactly where he aims it. She moved to the doorway and looked out. He was standing in the corridor with a man she had seen before, one of the Tuesday visitors, a heavy-set man named Price, who managed something related to the Eastern Rail contracts. Price was red-faced and gesturing with a rolled document. Montgomery was perfectly still. The figures were approved, Price was saying. You approved them yourself in March. I approved a projection, Montgomery said, his voice entirely level. What you've submitted is not a projection. It is a fabrication with a signature attached to it. There is a difference, Mr. Price, and I expect the men in my employ to understand it. If you pull the contract now, the Fielding account collapses entirely, and we lose. I am aware of what we lose. A pause, precise and intentional. I am also aware that if I allow falsified numbers to pass through this office without consequence, I lose something considerably more valuable than the Fielding account. Price stared at him. And what is that? The right to call anything in this company accurate. The silence that followed was absolute. Price left 2 minutes later, taking the rolled document with him. Montgomery stood in the corridor alone for a moment, and then he turned and saw her standing in the library doorway. They looked at each other across the width of the corridor. She had not meant to be seen. She had no idea what expression was on her face. Whatever it was, he looked at it for a moment and then said with perfect evenness, "I apologize for the disruption." "Don't," she said. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. The closest thing to surprise she had seen on him yet. "Don't apologize for that," she clarified. "What you said was right." He held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned and walked back toward the east study, and the door closed behind him, and Theodora stood in the library doorway with the strange and unwelcome feeling that she had just understood something about him she hadn't intended to understand. The crack appeared at the end of the 3rd week. It was small, almost nothing. The kind of thing a person could choose not to notice if they were determined enough. She had been sitting at the library table late on a Friday evening, working through a set of correspondence she had taken on at Mrs. Harlowe's suggestion, responses to various social invitations that required the lady of the house to answer. She had been at it for 2 hours and was on the last letter when the door opened. Montgomery stood in the doorway. He had his jacket off, his collar loosened. The first time she had seen him look anything other than completely assembled. He was holding a book. He looked at her at the table. He looked at the letters. "You don't have to do those," he said. "I know," she said. "I offered. Mrs. Harlowe shouldn't have accepted. I insisted." She looked up at him. "I needed something useful to do." He didn't respond to that immediately. He came into the room, not toward her, just into the room, and went to the far shelf and replaced the book he'd been carrying. Then he paused, standing with his back to her, his hand still resting lightly on the spine of the book. "You find idleness difficult," he said. "Not a question." "Enormously," she said. A moment passed. "So do I," he said quietly, almost to himself, almost to the shelf. He left without saying anything further. Theodora sat at the library table and looked at the empty doorway for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the letter in front of her and finished writing it, her handwriting steady and even, the same as it always was. But something in the room felt different. Not warmer exactly, not safer, just different. Like a window had been opened somewhere in the house, so slightly you couldn't feel the air moving, but you knew something had shifted, because the quality of the silence had changed. She sealed the last letter. She put out the lamp. And she thought about the old letter in the leather case at the bottom of her trunk, the one she had not read in weeks, the one she was going to have to deal with eventually, the one that carried a name she had not spoken aloud since the morning she arrived at this house. Soon, she told herself. Not yet, but soon. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not the one from the bottom of her trunk. That one she still hadn't opened, still hadn't dealt with, still carried around like a stone sewn into the lining of everything she did. This was a new letter, thinner, addressed in a handwriting she recognized immediately, because it was her sister's, and Clara's handwriting had always looked like someone had taught her the alphabet and then immediately frightened her. Theodora read it at the library table, alone, with the door closed. Clara wrote that she was well, that the house on Carver Street was comfortable, that their father was sleeping more than usual but eating adequately, that everything was fine and she was not to worry. And then, in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, almost buried beneath the pleasantries like a stone beneath shallow water, Clara wrote that a man had come to the house, that he had asked questions, that he had not given his name, but that he had mentioned Sinclair Steel twice in the course of the conversation, and that he had seemed very interested in the textile ledgers their father kept in the back office. The ledgers. Theodora set the letter down on the table. She sat very still for a long moment, the way a person sits when they are doing rapid and invisible calculations, when the surface is calm, because every available resource is occupied somewhere underneath it. The textile ledgers. She knew exactly what was in those ledgers. She had known for 2 years. She had known since the afternoon she found them in a drawer her father had always kept locked, on a day when her father was not home and the key had been left carelessly on his desk, and she had opened them because she was 23 years old, and her family was falling apart, and she had needed to understand why. What she found in those ledgers had not been what she expected. What she found had been the reason Sinclair Steel had absorbed the Winslow account so quickly, so cleanly, so completely. Not because her father had been unlucky, not because the textile market had turned, but because someone had been systematically redirecting funds from the Winslow accounts into a secondary ledger for the better part of 4 years. Someone whose initials appeared at the bottom of every redirected entry. Initials she had recognized. Initials that belonged to a name she had not spoken aloud since the morning she arrived at Sinclair House. She did not tell Montgomery, not that day, not the day after. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was partially true. She told herself she needed to think it through carefully before introducing a complication of this magnitude into a household that was still finding its balance, which was also partially true. The full truth was simpler and less flattering. She was afraid of what he would do with the information, not because she thought he would use it against her. She had developed, over the past weeks, a cautious and still unfinished opinion of his character that didn't include that particular fear. But because she did not yet know how much of the damage was her father's responsibility and how much belonged to someone else, and she was not willing to lay the whole story open in front of a man she had known for less than a month and trust that he would handle it with the care it required. So she kept it, and the weight of keeping it changed her in small ways that she noticed but could not entirely control. Montgomery noticed too. He said nothing about it directly. That was not how he operated, she had learned. He did not ask personal questions, he did not press, but she could feel the shift in his attention, the way it moved toward her differently now, with a precision that suggested he had registered the change and filed it somewhere for later consideration. They were at dinner on a Thursday evening when she felt it most clearly. The table between them was the same as always, long, formal, lit by 2 candelabras that Mrs. Harlow refreshed every other day. The food was good. The silence was familiar, but Montgomery looked up from his plate at a particular moment, for no particular reason, and looked at her across the length of the table, and she had the very specific and uncomfortable sensation of being read. Not looked at, read. "You've been quiet this week," he said. "I'm often quiet," she replied. "Not like this." She met his eyes. His expression was neutral as always, but there was something underneath the neutrality now, something she might have called concern if she had been inclined toward generosity, or watchfulness if she had been inclined toward caution. She was inclined toward both. "I received a letter from my sister," she said, which was true. "Is she well?" "She says so." A pause. He picked up his glass, looked into it briefly, set it down. "If there is something requiring my attention in relation to your family," he said carefully, "I would prefer to know about it directly, rather than observe it from across the dinner table." The sentence was measured, precise. It was the closest thing to an offer she had heard from him, and she understood it as such. Not warmth exactly, but a door left open a specific number of inches, enough to walk through if she chose to. She chose not to. Not yet. "Everything is fine," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her for one moment longer than the conversation required. Then he returned to his dinner. It was the following Monday when things began to move faster than she was ready for. She was crossing the main hall in the late morning when she heard voices in the East study, not the Tuesday and Thursday kind of voices, not the scheduled meeting cadence she had grown accustomed to, but something quicker and less controlled. She recognized one voice as Montgomery's. The second belonged to a man named Aldrich, who she knew was Montgomery's head of accounts, and whom she had met twice at formal dinners. A thin and careful man who never seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin. She did not stop walking. She was not the kind of woman who pressed her ear to doors, but the hall was not wide and the door was not thick, and she heard 4 words clearly as she passed. Winslow, secondary ledger, discrepancy. She stopped. She stood in the middle of the hall for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the library, closed the door behind her, and sat down in the chair by the window. Her hands were folded in her lap. Outside, 2 delivery men were unloading crates from a wagon onto the cobblestone. One of them was laughing at something the other had said. Theodora watched them and breathed carefully and thought about the leather case at the bottom of her trunk. The letter inside it had been written by a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss had been her father's business partner for 11 years. He had sat at their family table. He had attended her mother's funeral. He had been the kind of man who made himself indispensable through a slow and patient accumulation of proximity, who inserted himself into every significant decision until the person making the decisions could no longer clearly remember which ideas had been theirs. Gerald Foss had also, over the course of 4 years, redirected just over $31,000 from the Winslow textile accounts into a private holding. Not all at once, never in amounts large enough to trigger immediate alarm, just steadily, carefully, invisibly, the way water moves through stone. And Gerald Foss, in the letter she had been carrying for 2 years, had written to her father to explain what he had done and why he had done it, apparently under the impression that her father already knew and had agreed to it, apparently under the impression that the arrangement had been mutual. It had not been mutual. Her father had known nothing, which meant that the debt that had consumed the Winslow holdings, the debt that had brought Theodora to this house, to that contract, to this particular chair, in this particular library, on this particular Monday morning, had been manufactured, not entirely, not cleanly, but significantly enough that it changed the shape of everything. And now Aldrich had found the discrepancy. She went to the East Study at 4 o'clock that afternoon. She knocked twice. Montgomery's voice came through the door immediately. "Come in." And she opened it and stepped inside and closed it behind her. He was at his desk. He looked up. He saw her face. Something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that a stranger would have caught, but she was no longer a stranger to his expressions, and she caught it. He set down his pen. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand," she said. A pause. "All right." She looked at him across the width of the study, across the desk, the maps, the shelves of books, the 2 weeks and 3 weeks and 1 month of silence and proximity and small accumulated moments that had made this room, somehow, less foreign to her than it had been on the morning she first walked into it. "You found something in the Winslow ledgers today," she said. He was very still. "I know what it is," she continued. "I've known for 2 years, and I need to tell you something about it before whoever found it tells you their version first." Montgomery Sinclair looked at her for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked. The late afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the corner of his desk in a long, pale rectangle. "Then tell me," he said. His voice was even, careful. But underneath it, and she heard this clearly, the way she heard things clearly when it mattered, underneath it was something that was neither accusation nor absolution. It was waiting. He was waiting to hear what she said before deciding anything. She had not known until that moment how much she had needed that. She took a breath, and she began. She told him everything, not quickly, not in the breathless, unraveling way of someone confessing out of panic. She told him the way she had always done the hardest things in her life, steadily, in order, without decoration. She told him about the locked drawer and the careless key. She told him about the afternoon she sat alone in her father's back office and opened the secondary ledger and understood page by page what she was looking at. She told him about Gerald Foss, his 11 years at her father's side, his patient and invisible accumulation of access, the $31,000 moved in increments small enough to pass unnoticed until the damage was already complete. She told him about the letter. Montgomery did not interrupt her once. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his expression entirely still, and he listened to every word she said with the complete and undivided attention of a man who understands that the most dangerous thing he can do in this particular moment is speak before he has heard everything. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Outside, the early winter wind had picked up along the avenue. She could hear it moving against the window glass, a low, persistent sound like the city itself leaning in to listen. "The letter," he said finally. "Where is it now?" "In my room." "You've had it for 2 years." "Yes." "And you brought it here when you came?" "Yes." He looked at her, not with anger. She had steeled herself for anger, had rehearsed in her mind how she would respond to it, had decided she would not apologize for the timing, even if he demanded it. But what she saw on his face was not anger. It was something more complicated and in some ways harder to read. It was the expression of a man recalculating, of a man taking a structure he believed was solid and testing it, quietly and methodically, against new information. "Why didn't you tell me before today?" he asked. The question was direct. It deserved a direct answer. "Because I didn't know you," she said, "and I didn't know what you would do with it. And my father's name was already damaged enough, without me handing the full story to a man whose primary interest was the financial resolution." A pause. "And now," he said. "Now Aldrich has found the discrepancy," she said, "which means The story is moving whether I direct it or not, and I would rather you hear it from me." He was quiet for a long moment. "Get the letter," he said. She brought it to him 20 minutes later. He read it at his desk, while she stood at the window and watched the avenue below. The carriages moving through the early dark, the lamplighter making his way down the far side of the street, the ordinary and indifferent machinery of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this particular room. She heard the paper settle on the desk behind her. "Foss," he said. "Yes, I know that name." She turned. "I thought you might." Montgomery stood up from his desk. He moved to the window beside her. Not close, not the proximity of intimacy, but close enough that she was aware of him in the particular way she had become aware of him over the past weeks. Present, deliberate, never accidental. "Gerald Foss submitted a proposal to Sinclair Steel 14 months ago," he said. "A supply chain arrangement, textiles specifically." He paused. "I declined it." "Why?" "The numbers were constructed," he said. "Not falsified exactly, but constructed, built to look better than they were by someone who understood how to arrange figures on a page without technically lying." He looked at the letter on his desk. "It appears that is a particular skill of his." Theodora absorbed this. "He needed your legitimacy," she said slowly. "He took the money from my father's accounts, needed a way to move it through something credible, came to you, and when I declined, the arrangement collapsed," Montgomery said. "Which accelerated the pressure on the Winslow accounts, which accelerated the debt timeline. The full shape of it settled between them in the room. Her family had not simply been unlucky. They had not simply been outmaneuvered by a larger competitor. They had been a resource, used, drained, and then released when they were no longer useful, by a man who had sat at their table and known her mother's name. She had known this for 2 years. She had carried it for 2 years, but hearing it spoken aloud, assembled into its complete and logical sequence by another person, made it newly and differently heavy. Montgomery turned from the window and looked at her directly. "Your father didn't know," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "He knew the accounts were failing. He didn't know why. And the contract between us, the marriage, you entered into it knowing all of this." "Yes, you could have told me before you signed. You could have used it as leverage." She met his eyes. "I could have," she said. "I didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Something she had seen only in pieces before now, always briefly, always retreating. But it was there in full for just a moment, before his face settled back into its characteristic stillness. "Why not?" he asked quietly. "Because it wasn't leverage," she said. "It was the truth, and I wasn't ready to give it to someone I didn't trust yet." The word "yet" sat in the air between them. Neither of them addressed it directly, but it was there. Montgomery moved quickly after that, because moving quickly was what he did when a problem had been fully defined. He sent for Aldrich that same evening. He sent a second message to his legal counsel. By the following morning, 2 investigators had been dispatched to verify the ledger entries against the Foss correspondence. And by Wednesday of the following week, Gerald Foss had been formally presented with documentation of what Sinclair Steel's accounting team had reconstructed. Theodora was not in the room for any of it. Montgomery did not ask her to be, and she did not ask to be. She had carried the information for 2 years. She was content to let someone else carry the weight of what came next. What came next was significant. The Foss arrangement, once fully reconstructed, implicated not only Gerald Foss, but 2 secondary investors who had benefited from the redirected funds. The legal proceedings that followed were not public. Montgomery had ensured that with the specific and deliberate intention of keeping the Winslow name out of the court documents. The financial settlement that resulted from those proceedings was routed through a series of careful and quiet transactions back into the Winslow accounts. Not all $31,000, but enough. Enough that her father's remaining debts were cleared entirely. Enough that the house on Carver Street was no longer provisional. Enough that Clara would not have to enter into any arrangement of her own out of necessity. Theodora learned all of this on a Friday afternoon when Montgomery came to the library and placed a single document on the table beside her book and said, "This is the accounting summary. I thought you should see it." She read it, all of it, carefully. When she looked up, he was standing at the shelf with his back to her, his hand resting on the spine of the Marcus Aurelius, the one with the annotations in the margins. "You protected my father's name," she said. "The exposure of it served no useful purpose," he replied. "That isn't the same as a legal obligation," she said. "You didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without turning around, "No, I didn't." She looked at the document in her hands, at the columns of figures that represented 2 years of wait now resolved, at the signature at the bottom of the settlement summary. M. Sinclair, written in the same clean, deliberate hand she had seen on the contract she had signed on her first morning in this house. She set the document down. "Montgomery," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned. She did not look away. "Thank you." He held her gaze across the room, across the library table, the 2 candles, the shelves of books that had become, over the past weeks, as familiar to her as anything she had grown up with. His expression was the one she had come to recognize as his version of unguarded. Not open, not soft, not the face of a man who had misplaced his defenses, just the face of a man who had, for this particular moment, chosen not to deploy them. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I know," she said. "I would have, eventually." "I believe you," he said. And the way he said it, simply without qualification, without the slight reservation she had learned to listen for in his voice, told her something she had not expected to learn in this room on this particular Friday afternoon. He meant it. The 2-year clause in their contract became over the following month something neither of them referenced directly. Not because they had decided anything. No conversation took place, no terms were renegotiated, no document was revised. It was simply that the architecture of their daily life had shifted in ways that made the clause feel like a relic of a different arrangement, one entered into by 2 people who had not yet sat across a library table at 11 o'clock at night, reading different books in the same lamplight, who had not yet stood side by side at the Hartwell Christmas dinner and moved through the room with the particular ease of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms, who had not yet had a conversation that mattered. They had by then had several conversations that mattered. Not dramatic ones, not the sweeping, declarative kind, the quiet kind, the kind built from accumulated evenings and shared silences, and the slow, unglamorous work of learning to trust someone you did not choose, in the way people are supposed to choose each other. Montgomery did not become a different man. He remained precise. He remained controlled. He remained the kind of person who arrived at breakfast at 6:45 and expected the house to run like a well-maintained piece of machinery. He still spent more hours at his desk than was reasonable. He still communicated in sentences that were shorter than they needed to be, and silences that were longer. But the silences had changed. They were no longer the silences of 2 strangers performing the minimum requirements of a contractual arrangement. They were the silences of 2 people who had decided without announcing it that they were not going anywhere. Gerald Foss left Alderwick in January, quietly, without a forwarding address, in the manner of men who understand that the city they are leaving no longer has any use for them. Theodora's father recovered slowly, not fully. He was not a man built for the kind of loss he had endured, and some losses do not reverse entirely, no matter how the financial columns resolve. But he recovered enough to sit in the garden on mild days, enough to write to her on Sundays, in the careful, slightly formal handwriting of a man relearning how to communicate with a daughter who had grown, in his absence, into someone he was still figuring out. She wrote back every week without fail, Clara, for her part, enrolled in a teaching program in the spring and sent Theodora a letter describing her first classroom with the specific and breathless enthusiasm of someone who has discovered, later than expected, exactly what they are supposed to be doing. Theodora read that letter at the library table and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled for a very long time. On the last evening of the year, Montgomery found her standing at the window in the east study. She had come in to return a book she had borrowed from his shelf, the Marcus Aurelius, which she had finally asked to read and which had, it turned out, contained annotations worth reading. She had been looking at the city through the window, at Alderwick lit up in the cold, clear dark, at the smokestacks and the steeples and the low, constant glow of the furnaces that never fully went out. He came in behind her and stopped when he saw her there. She heard him pause, heard him decide, in the way she could now hear him decide things, not to leave. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked at the city together, at the empire he had built from a single foundry, at the streets he had shaped, the rails he had laid, the industry that bore his name and would bear it long after both of them were gone. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "All of it? The way you built it?" He considered the question the way he considered all serious questions, without rushing, without deflecting. "Parts of it," he said finally, "the parts where I confused speed for wisdom." A pause. "You?" She knew what he was asking, not about the steel, Not about the city. No, she said. He turned his head and looked at her profile. She kept her eyes on the city for a moment longer, then turned and met his gaze. In the cold, clear light coming through the window, with Alderwick burning steadily behind him, and the old year ending and neither of them saying anything that needed to be said with words, Montgomery Sinclair looked at Theodora Winslow the way a man looks at something he almost didn't recognize the value of until it was nearly too late. She looked back at him the same way. The empire of Sinclair Steel stood intact at the close of 1889. But the man who had built it was not the same man who had sat across a desk from a woman with rain in her hair and called her a solution. And Alderwick, which had feared Montgomery Sinclair for a decade, would spend the next decade learning something it had not expected to learn, that the woman who had walked into Sinclair House with a single trunk and a secret she hadn't yet given away had not softened the Steel King. She had simply shown him what the steel was for.